Imagine you're a royal surgeon in the year 1347, summoned in the dead of night to a candlelit chamber that smells faintly of incense and iron. Before you lies the lifeless body of a young noblewoman, her wrists bound with silken cord. You've been ordered to prepare her for a sacred ritual, one so secret it's not found in any church record, yet sanctioned by the highest powers. What could possibly justify such a violation? And how many times has this been done before? In the name of God. What you're about to hear will change everything you thought you knew about medieval morality. This wasn't a nightmare. This was daily reality in medieval Europe. While history books paint the Middle Ages as an era of knights, castles, and chivalry, the truth is far darker. Beneath the hymns of the cathedral and the clang of the blacksmith's forge, rituals took place that blurred the line between worship and depravity. You think you know medieval morality? You don't. In noble courts, sexual practices were not just private acts, they were tools of power, punishment, and control. Priests and monarchs often claimed that the body was a battlefield for the soul, and what happened behind closed doors could cleanse or damn an entire bloodline. Some acts were disguised as penance, others as blessings, but all carried an unspoken understanding. The powerful could command anything, and the powerless had no choice. Why did the church turn a blind eye or sometimes even participate? The answer lies in the medieval belief that sin could be purged through the flesh, a philosophy twisted to justify acts that today would be considered crimes of the worst kind. Chronicles from the 12th and 13th centuries describe holy trials, where women were subjected to invasive examinations by clerics supposedly to test for witchcraft or moral impurity, but in reality, an excuse for sanctioned violation. And when famine struck, when plague spread, when war loomed on the horizon, these rituals often grew more desperate, more extreme. People believed that sexual acts performed under certain conditions could appease God, drive away demons, or even save an entire kingdom from ruin. Some of the darkest secrets were whispered not in taverns or palaces, but in places draped in silence and stone, where the smell of incense masked something far less holy. Behind the monastery walls, purity was preached, but something else was practiced. These were places the common people believed to be sanctuaries of holiness, where men and women dedicated their lives to God, far from the temptations of the flesh. But what if the greatest temptations were not outside those walls, but festering within them? In many abbeys and convents, isolation created a breeding ground for forbidden desires, and the very vows of chastity and obedience became weapons for exploitation. When one person holds absolute spiritual authority over another, how far can that power be pushed before it turns into abuse? Surviving accounts, often buried deep in ecclesiastical archives, tell of nuns coerced into spiritual cleansing rituals by priests, acts framed as necessary for the salvation of the soul. Imagine being told that God required your body as an offering not in metaphor, but in the most literal, physical way possible. To refuse meant risking damnation, or worse, being accused of heresy, a charge that could end at the stake. And it wasn't only women. Young boys sent to monasteries for education or service often became targets, told that their purity made them especially fit for holy instruction. What began as religious mentorship sometimes crossed into acts that shattered lives, but were hidden under layers of ritual and prayer. The victims had no recourse. How could you accuse God's chosen servants and expect to be believed? Some monasteries even developed elaborate coded systems to conceal these practices. Rooms disguised as prayer cells that locked from the outside. Secret tunnels connecting male and female quarters. Ledger books where gifts from patrons were noted in exchange for private blessings. These euphemisms shielded the reality. Flesh traded under the cover of piety. When visiting bishops or royal patrons arrived, the worst evidence was concealed. The victims, silenced by fear, were paraded as examples of spiritual devotion, and those who dared speak out, their confessions were rewritten or destroyed, their reputations smeared until no one would listen. What's most disturbing is how some orders justified these acts in theological terms. They claimed that the body was merely a vessel, and using it to serve the church was the highest form of devotion. The idea was poisonous, and it spread far beyond monastery walls. Because if those entrusted with the care of souls could twist faith into a weapon of the flesh, what did that mean for the rulers who controlled both church and crown? The trail of power, lust, and secrecy led straight to the highest thrones in Europe. And the people who sat upon them were about to take these practices to an entirely new level. In the royal courts of medieval Europe, desire wasn't a private indulgence, it was a weapon. Kings, queens, and nobles used intimacy the way they used armies, to win loyalty, to punish rivals, to secure power at any cost. But what happened in those bedchambers could be as bloody, as cruel, and as calculated as any war. To the outside world, courtship seemed wrapped in romance nights, pledging themselves to noble ladies, queens embodying grace and virtue. But strip away the poetry, and you'd find something far darker. How do you say no when the crown itself demands your obedience? Royal mistresses and lovers were rarely chosen for beauty alone. Often, they were political pawns, selected for the alliances their families could provide. A baron's daughter might be summoned to a king's chamber as an honor, only to find herself trapped in a role she could never refuse. To reject such a summons was to insult the monarch and risk the destruction of your family's name. Some rulers elevated this into theater. Lavish masques and court entertainments sometimes hid humiliating rituals in plain sight. Guests might be forced to perform scenes of seduction or submission while the court looked on, their discomfort part of the show. What looked like harmless spectacle was often a public display of the monarch's control over the bodies of their subjects. Queens were not spared. In some courts, they were compelled to take part in so-called fertility ceremonies, involving multiple partners, all under the justification of securing an heir. Imagine standing in a gilded hall, under the gaze of your husband's advisors, your body treated as nothing more than a political vessel. When whispers threatened royal reputations, the machinery of the court moved quickly to silence them. Servants who knew too much vanished. Correspondence was burned. Chroniclers omitted entire events. The truth was buried under layers of protocol and polished lies. But the most dangerous threat to a ruler's power often came not from enemies, but from lovers. One rumor, one betrayal, one whispered accusation could unravel a dynasty. Kings kept spies in their queens' bedchambers. Queens placed loyal ladies-in-waiting to monitor the king's every move. Trust was rare, and paranoia was constant. The church, meant to serve as the moral compass of Christendom, sometimes played its own role in this dance. Bishops could broker discreet liaisons if it meant securing influence. If a union, whether public or private, strengthened the church's hand, sins could be quietly forgiven. Yet, beneath the gilded ceilings and perfumed air, the fear lingered. Because everyone at court knew that the same tactics used to control others could just as easily be turned on them. This tension created a culture where manipulation, seduction, and coercion became as natural as breathing. For the courtiers, ladies-in-waiting, and servants drawn into this web, survival depended on navigating every glance, every word, every hidden meaning. One wrong move could ruin you. One wrong alliance could end you. And perhaps the most chilling truth of all was how ordinary it became. When the abuse of power is dressed in the trappings of tradition, how do you even recognize it as abuse anymore? Because once kings and queens learned that pleasure could be turned into politics, they perfected it, making it part of the machinery of the state itself. The palace became a theater of control, each performance more elaborate than the last, each scandal buried deeper beneath layers of ceremony. But beyond the marble halls and jeweled crowns, there was another arena where power and flesh collided without restraint. It was a place where royal decree meant nothing, where rules dissolved into chaos, and where acts of brutality were carried out under banners of holy purpose. And the further from the court you went, the darker it became. Far from the polished marble of the royal court, another kind of power was at play, one drenched in dust, blood, and the smell of burning flesh. The banners overhead bore crosses. The speeches spoke of God's glory. But what happened beneath them often had more in common with a drunken brawl than a holy mission. This was the world of the Crusades, where faith and violence mixed into something far more dangerous: lawless indulgence, wrapped in divine permission. Imagine riding for weeks across blistering plains, armor baking in the sun, the air thick with sweat and desperation. The men around you are soldiers, mercenaries, criminals who joined the campaign to avoid the gallows. And in this roving army, normal rules don't just bend, they vanish entirely. The church promised that taking the cross would wipe away all sins, no matter how dark. If every sin can be forgiven, what happens to the people who commit them? Many took this as a license to indulge their worst impulses, knowing confession was just a priest's tent away. And when the bloodlust of battle mixed with the intoxication of victory, sexual violence became as much a part of the spoils as gold or land. Accounts from the siege of Jerusalem in 1099 describe scenes of carnage, followed by days of chaos. Women, and in some cases, boys, were taken as trophies. Some were traded between knights like fine wine. Others were forced to march with the army as camp followers, used until they collapsed. What did it mean to be saved by such an army? For many, salvation looked like another form of captivity. The horror wasn't confined to enemies. Even fellow Christians were not safe from the predations of the crusading masses. Towns along the route were taxed, not only in goods but in bodies young women and children offered up by terrified families hoping to avoid slaughter. If you think holy war meant honor, think again. Behind the front lines, camp life became its own dark ecosystem. Makeshift brothels sprang up in tents and barns, some staffed by captives, others by desperate locals seeking protection in exchange for their bodies. Disease spread quickly, cutting down soldiers faster than enemy arrows. Yet still, the cycle continued, fueled by superstition and desire. Some crusading orders, especially those with heavy church oversight, tried to regulate this chaos, but their methods were often as brutal as the acts they sought to control. Women caught in unauthorized liaisons could be flogged, mutilated, or executed, while the men walked free. The imbalance was deliberate, maintaining discipline through fear, especially fear of sexual punishment. And there were the so-called penitential rituals, bizarre ceremonies where soldiers were encouraged to purify themselves before battle through acts that blurred the line between religious devotion and public humiliation. In some cases, this meant stripping naked before a crowd while confessing sins in explicit detail, a spectacle that satisfied more than just spiritual curiosity. But perhaps the darkest episodes came during long sieges, when supplies ran low and tempers flared. Starving armies turned inward, preying on their own. Historical letters and chronicles, some written in careful Latin to mask their meaning, hint at orgies inside fortified camps, where rank and hunger dictated who could touch whom. The most vulnerable, as always, were those with no sword and no say. When the fighting ended, the victors often claimed divine favor had excused all they had done. The spoils of war included not just treasures and territory, but human beings sold in slave markets from Antioch to Venice. And while the official histories spoke of courage and piety, the real stories were whispered in taverns and hidden in diaries. Why does this matter? Because these crusading armies didn't just vanish when the wars ended. They returned home, carrying with them the behaviors they had learned in the absence of law. What happens when an entire generation of men is taught that desire and violence are two sides of the same coin? You get those patterns seeping into local feuds, village disputes, even the ways lords ruled their lands. In some regions, former crusaders founded chivalric orders that publicly celebrated honor while privately indulging in the same abuses they had practiced abroad. The armor may have been polished, the language refined, but the brutality was the same. Women of noble birth were courted aggressively, sometimes abducted under the guise of marriage by capture, a tradition that blurred consent beyond recognition. And yet, for all its horror, this wasn't the lowest point. There was another arena, one hidden behind high stone walls and oaths of loyalty, where the line between loyalty and possession disappeared entirely. Because while war gave men an excuse to take what they wanted, the feudal system gave them the legal right to do it. The most chilling truth of the medieval world is that some of its most horrifying sexual practices didn't happen in secret at all. They were enshrined in law, celebrated in custom, and passed down as inheritance. And the people who lived under that system had no choice but to submit until the day those same customs turned on their masters. If you think war was the worst place for these acts, you're wrong. The most disturbing practices weren't committed by nameless soldiers in far-off lands. They were carried out at home, under the protection of the law itself. In the manors and estates of Europe, lords claimed rights over their subjects' bodies that no priest dared challenge. What kind of world allows a man's title to decide what happens in your bed? And what happens when that same power is passed from father to son, generation after generation? The answer is a tradition so twisted, it almost defies belief. In the feudal estates of medieval Europe, your body could be as much a part of your lord's property as the land you worked. This wasn't rumor. In some regions, it was written into custom, passed down as if it were a sacred right. Imagine living under a system where the man who owned your fields also claimed ownership over your most private moments. This so-called right of the first night, later known in French as droit du seigneur, has been debated by historians for centuries. Was it law? Was it tradition? Or was it a weapon disguised as privilege? Records are scarce, but surviving court cases, folk tales, and whispered village accounts paint a disturbing picture. Newly married brides, summoned to the manor on their wedding night, ordered to share the bed of their lord before their own husband. Who would dare refuse? Refusal meant losing your land, your livestock, or worse, your life. For peasants living hand to mouth, survival often meant silence. Husbands were powerless, forced to stand aside while their wives were taken in the name of honor. The humiliation was not just personal, it was political, a reminder to every man in the village of exactly who held the power. Some lords cloaked the practice in ceremony. They called it a blessing, a way to ensure fertility in the marriage. Others were less subtle, treating it as open sport. Chronicles from rural France and Scotland hint at feast nights where multiple couples were summoned, their brides lined up like offerings. And if you think these feasts ended at the bedroom door, think again. Not all abuses targeted women. In some areas, male servants or young grooms were subjected to tests of loyalty that were anything but symbolic. Physical violation became a way to mark ownership, to make it clear that a man's service extended beyond labor in the fields or the stables. What did loyalty mean when it was taken by force? Religious authorities sometimes condemned the practice in public sermons, but in private, many bishops and abbots enjoyed the same privileges over their own tenants. When both the manor and the monastery claimed control over your body, where could you turn for protection? It wasn't only peasants who suffered. In noble courts, lesser-ranking ladies were often pressured into arrangements with higher lords as a condition for marriage alliances. If you were born into the wrong tier of nobility, your wedding could become a transaction that began in the chapel and ended in someone else's bedchamber. The custom's power wasn't just in the act itself, it was in the fear it created. Every whispered threat, every rumor of a bride summoned to the manor, kept the rest of the village in line. This fear was as effective as chains, ensuring obedience without the need for constant violence. Over time, some regions began to formalize the abuse into fines or payments. If a peasant didn't want his bride taken, he could buy out the right, paying the lord in coin, livestock, or crops. But even then, the exchange was a reminder of who truly owned what. When you have to pay to keep your own wedding bed untouched, what freedom do you really have? And yet, the most chilling accounts aren't of the nights themselves, but of the aftermath. Children born under such circumstances carried the unspoken weight of their origins. Inheritance disputes could erupt decades later when the question of paternity threatened to unravel land claims. Some lords even acknowledged these children openly, using them as pawns in their dynastic games. The so-called right of the first night may not have been universal, but where it existed, it turned marriage into a performance and intimacy into a public show of submission. And in the shadows of these manorial halls, even darker bargains were being struck, ones that didn't end at the wedding bed. Because once a system teaches that bodies can be claimed like land, It opens the door to trades, sales, and exchanges that make even this tradition look tame. And that's exactly where the next part of this story leads, into the hidden marketplaces of flesh that thrived in medieval towns, right under the church's watchful gaze. If the manors were where power claimed the body, the towns were where it sold it. In the bustling streets of medieval Europe, under the watchtowers and cathedral bells, there existed a trade that the church publicly condemned and quietly regulated. This was the world of the medieval sex trade, a marketplace as organized and entrenched as the baker's guild or the blacksmith's forge. Imagine stepping into a narrow alley just after nightfall, the scent of roasted meat from the taverns mingling with the musk of sweat and cheap perfume. Lanterns sway in the breeze, casting flickers of light on doorways marked with discreet symbols, a painted glove, a sprig of rosemary, a red-shuttered window. You might think these places were hidden in shame, but many operated in plain sight, protected by law and blessed by the same authorities who denounced them on Sunday morning. In many cities, brothels were not just tolerated, they were owned by the municipality or the local lord. Some were even managed by clerics who argued that by controlling the trade, they could contain sin and prevent greater moral decay. But how do you contain something when you profit from it? The most disturbing aspect wasn't the existence of these brothels, but who was inside them. While some women entered by choice, often due to poverty, many were there against their will. Orphans, debtors, and even kidnapped travelers found themselves trapped in contracts they couldn't escape, and among them were children. Some, barely into their teens, sold as fresh stock to wealthier clients. The church's stance was a tangle of contradiction. On paper, prostitution was a mortal sin. In practice, many towns licensed brothels, collected taxes from them, and used the revenue to fund public works, sometimes even cathedral construction. What does it mean when a holy building is paid for with the wages of exploitation? Markets were seasonal too. Major religious festivals brought an influx of pilgrims, and with them a spike in demand. Special, temporary brothels would spring up near pilgrimage routes, their owners often paying a fee directly to the local abbey for protection. Priests would preach about chastity in the morning, then look the other way that same night. Inside, the conditions were brutal. Women were often required to serve dozens of clients a day. Those who resisted were beaten, starved, or locked in dark cells until they submitted. Disease spread rapidly, and the medieval understanding of medicine offered little relief. In some towns, women showing visible signs of illness were expelled to the streets to die, replaced by new captives within days. But the trade wasn't confined to permanent establishments. Flesh markets took place in daylight, disguised as fairs or maid markets. On the surface, they appeared to be gatherings for hiring servants or farmhands. In reality, many of these transactions ended with the buyer taking the servant straight to a private chamber. The paperwork, if it existed, framed the sale as a work contract, but the terms were understood by everyone present. What's even more chilling is how normalized this was. Townspeople might gossip about a scandal, but the system itself was rarely questioned. For many, it was just another part of life, as much a fixture as the market square or the church steeple. Some women managed to escape, but survival outside the system was rare. Without family or trade skills, they often fell back into the same cycle, sometimes willingly returning to a brothel, because at least there, they had food and shelter. When captivity starts to feel safer than freedom, you know the world has failed you. Children raised inside these establishments faced a grim future. Many were trained from an early age to take the place of their mothers, perpetuating the trade for another generation. A child's first memory might be of a drunken song, a locked door, and hands that didn't belong to family. And the buyers? They were not the outcasts of society, but often its leaders. Merchants, knights, even visiting clergy, all could be found among the clientele. How can morality survive when its enforcers indulge in the same sins they punish others for? There were moments of resistance. In some towns, local women formed alliances to track missing girls or petition the church for intervention. A few bishops attempted crackdowns, closing brothels and jailing owners. But without changing the demand, these victories were short-lived. The trade simply moved underground, growing more secretive and more dangerous. Over time, as Europe shifted into the later Middle Ages, the trade became more organized, with networks stretching across borders. A girl taken from a village in Flanders might end up in a brothel in Paris, Barcelona, or even the port cities of the Mediterranean. In this way, medieval Europe created one of the first truly international trafficking systems centuries before anyone gave it a name. And while the market thrived in towns and cities, there was another sphere where flesh was bought and sold without coin at all. It happened in the shadows of castles, under the guise of service and loyalty. These were not transactions between strangers, but exchanges within households, and when the owner of that household was a knight trained in both warfare and entitlement, the consequences were as brutal as anything in the marketplace. If the brothels and marketplaces were the public face of exploitation, the castles were its private chambers. Behind walls of stone, where banners flew proudly and oaths of loyalty were sworn, bodies could be claimed as easily as land or livestock. Knights were sworn to codes of chivalry, but those codes applied only to equals. Peasants, servants, and those without noble blood were outside the bounds of that honor. What happened to them behind closed doors was not considered a stain on reputation, it was considered privilege. Imagine being a young maid in a fortress perched on a cold, windy cliff. You sleep in the kitchens, rising before dawn to carry water up the steep stairs. One evening, you're summoned to the Lord's solar. Do you refuse, knowing the guards take orders only from him? Do you speak out, knowing the last girl who did was sent away and never seen again? In many castles, the hierarchy was absolute. Pages and squires were vulnerable too, told that training required obedience in all things. Some were kept as personal attendants and never allowed privacy, day or night. When loyalty is demanded through intimacy, it stops being loyalty, it becomes captivity. The church rarely intervened. If the offender was a noble patron, an indulgence could be purchased, wiping away the sin in the eyes of God. How much is forgiveness worth when it can be bought in gold? And for crimes against the poor, no one even bothered to ask forgiveness at all. Castles also housed captives from war. Noble women taken as hostages were treated with courtesy in public but locked away in private. A ransom could be paid in coin or in compliance. The line between protection and possession blurred completely. Even tournaments, the great displays of knightly skill, could mask predatory arrangements. Winners sometimes claimed favors from noble ladies as prizes, favors that went far beyond a ribbon or token. And refusal, in a court driven by political alliances, was rarely an option. Inside the household, survival meant learning unspoken rules. Never be alone in the wrong corridor. Never draw too much attention or too little. Servants shared whispered warnings about which hallways, staircases, or rooms to avoid after dark. Traveling lords carried the danger with them. Their entire retinue, servants, pages, companions, was expected to follow without question. In a world where the abuser controls your food, your bed, and your safety, where could you run? Chroniclers sometimes hinted at these abuses in coded phrases, favored page, cherished maid language that glossed over the lack of consent. Court poets romanticized them in verse, turning acts of coercion into tales of passion. History remembers the romance, but forgets the fear. And the most disturbing truth, much of it happened in plain sight. Feasts could include games where servants were ordered to entertain guests, sometimes in humiliating or invasive ways. No one dared intervene. Cruelty had become part of the spectacle. Power passed from father to son, and so did the unspoken rights over the people in the household. If a man grew up watching abuse treated as privilege, what would stop him from repeating it? Over time, these acts became part of castle culture, woven so deeply into life that they were almost impossible to challenge. Justice was rare. Accusing a knight or a lord meant challenging the very system that ruled you. Those who tried were often punished themselves, whipped, banished, or handed over to church courts that protected noble reputations over peasant voices. When the truth is too dangerous to speak, silence becomes a survival skill. Some castles even maintained structured systems of exploitation. Rooms were designated for privacy. Guards were assigned to prevent escape, and schedules were arranged to place certain people in the path of the Lord or his favored knights. It wasn't chaos, it was calculated control. Because in the medieval world, when violence and desire shared the same walls, those walls became a prison for anyone without power. And somewhere within those walls, there were figures who could move between manor, market, and castle, arranging encounters, trading favors, and ensuring the flow of desirable servants never ran dry. Once you see who those people were, you'll understand just how organized and unstoppable the medieval trade in human bodies had become. They weren't knights. They weren't lords. And yet, they could open any door in the medieval world. These shadow figures had no banners, no castles, but they held a kind of power more dangerous than steel. They knew everyone's secrets. They were stewards, chamberlains, and go-betweens, trusted household officials who managed the daily affairs of estates. On the surface, they dealt with accounts, supplies, and schedules. But in the shadows, many were the quiet architects of exploitation. They decided which servant was assigned to which duty, who attended which guest, and who was summoned to private meetings after dark. What happens when the one who controls your work also controls where you sleep? In castles, the steward could ensure a young maid was sent to serve wine at the exact moment a visiting knight grew curious. In towns, a chamberlain might recommend certain workers to influential clients, knowing exactly what kind of recommendation it really was. They were the bridges between power and prey, and because they operated in both noble and common spaces, they could move people like pieces on a chessboard. A servant from a rural manor could find herself transferred to a wealthy merchant's house in the city, never realizing the arrangement had nothing to do with her skills in the kitchen. How do you escape a trap when you don't even realize you've been caught? The church had its own version of these fixers' abbey officials who handled guest accommodations, pilgrimage lodging, and special introductions for high-ranking visitors. When holiness becomes a currency, who decides the price? Perhaps the most chilling part was how unremarkable they appeared. No one suspected the steward who balanced the books, or the chamberlain who arranged banquets, of orchestrating the quiet movement of flesh across Europe. But these figures were the threads tying manor, market, and monastery into one seamless network. They didn't just serve power, they supplied it. And when the demand was high, they looked beyond the estate walls. Fairs, festivals, even executions drew crowds, and with them, opportunities. Orphans, runaways, and the desperate were easy to collect, with no one to ask questions. A new servant could arrive at a castle one day and vanish into another household the next. This wasn't random cruelty. It was a system, efficient, profitable, and protected by the very people who claimed to uphold morality. The victims rarely saw the steward's hand in their fate, but he was always there, arranging, deciding, ensuring that power never went without its pleasures. And the higher you climb in this web, the more you see that it didn't stop at stewards and chamberlains. There was an even greater force, one that could unite warring nobles, silence the church, and make laws vanish overnight if they got in the way. Because in medieval Europe, there was only one power strong enough to shield the darkest practices from any consequence. And it wore a crown. At the top of the web sat the crown, the one power that could protect or destroy anyone beneath it. Kings and queens didn't just command armies, they controlled the laws that decided whether an act was a crime or a custom. If a noble faced scandal, the monarch could erase it with a pardon. If a bishop was accused, the king might resolve the matter with a quiet exchange of land or gold. How do you fight for justice when the highest court in the land is also the chief protector of the guilty? Royal courts became sanctuaries for the worst offenders. A favored knight accused of abusing a servant could be reassigned to a prestigious post. A wealthy merchant who supplied the crown could have accusations buried under layers of legal delay. And when the monarch themselves indulged in the same abuses, there was no authority left to answer to. The crown's reach extended beyond its own court. Laws on marriage, inheritance, and property gave rulers indirect control over bodies as well as lands. If the king wanted a union broken or forced, it was done. If a queen wished to claim a favored courtier, no one dared object. And because the crown controlled the chroniclers, history itself could be rewritten. The stories told to future generations would be cleansed of scandal, Replacing fear with fable, this was the heart of medieval power, a system where morality was dictated by the desires of those at the top. And while the crown could shield its favorites, it could just as easily unleash destruction on anyone who crossed it. But there was one force, even monarchs feared, a reckoning that came not from man, but from the heavens themselves.